Welcome to another GoLeanSixSigma.com webinar. We are so happy to have you join us today. This webinar series is for you, our learner community. Lean and Six Sigma are worldwide go-to improvement methods, and these webinars are part of our efforts to make it easy for you to use those tools and concepts. My name is Elizabeth Swan, and I'll be your moderator. Today's webinar is Introduction to PDCA, and our presenter is Tracy O'Rourke. Hello, Tracy.
Hi, how are you, Elizabeth?
I'm good, and I'm psyched for this. Tracy is a managing partner and executive advisor here at GoLeanSixSigma.com. A little background on Tracy. She's a co-host of the Just in Time Cafe podcast. She teaches Lean Six Sigma at the University of California at San Diego. She's a longtime Lean Six Sigma consultant and master black belt. Aside from over 20 years in the business, Tracy speaks at Lean Six Sigma conferences around the world. Tracy lives in San Diego, California with her husband and two sons. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here today.
During the presentation, you will all be in listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session following the presentation, but please feel free to ask questions anytime. You can just enter them into the question window. We'll ask you to participate in some polls, and if we don't answer all your questions during the webinar, we are definitely going to post all of the questions and the answers after the webinar. And you'll be able to see answers to everyone's questions, and you will be able to download this webinar once it's posted. Once again, you will have access to downloading this webinar after it's posted. And since you signed up, we'll let you know when it's posted. So our first interactive poll session is to find out where you are from. We have hundreds of attendees today. People are joining us from all over the world on this webinar, and we'd like to find out where. So if you click on question and type in where you are from, I'm guessing some of you are up early and quite a few are up very late. So let's see. All right, so let's take a look at where we're seeing. We've got John in Charlotte, North Carolina. We've got Christopher in the Bay Area. So you got Jesse in Minnesota. We've got Ray in Columbus, Ohio. Candace in Mississippi. We've got Josh in Pensacola. We have got, looks like Hugo Chakwe in Nigeria. Welcome.
Wow.
Yeah, no. Welcome. We've got Cherie from Minot, North Dakota. Oh man, people are calling in from all over the place. We got Valparaiso, Indiana. That's Christine. Fredericton, New Brunswick. That's Jane. Welcome, Jane. Man, we've got folks calling in from all over. You have a wide range there, Tracy.
Well, thank you. And thank you everybody for coming all over the world. That makes me feel great. And I really hope you see value in this webinar today on PDCA. So I just want to let you know that I've been with GoLean Six Sigma since its inception, and we have a couple of guiding principles. We believe in simplifying complex concepts, and we believe that complexity just confuses people. So our goal really is to demystify complex concepts, make training effective, practical, accessible, oh, and fun. Wouldn't that be good? So that's really our mission. And if you've been to any of our trainings, our online trainings, you have probably seen the Bahama Bistro. And if not, you should go. And ultimately, we've created a dreamy and relaxing training facility that we can send you to training for. So it's a really nice place. It's very enticing. Many organizations agree with our philosophy because here are some of the organizations that we've helped. And you can see that we've got all different kinds of organizations, from brick and mortar, online companies, diverse industries such as healthcare, manufacturing, financial services, and state government. Why? Because Lean Six Sigma is about problem solving, and every organization has problems to solve. They will always have problems to solve. And guess what? They need people that are good at problem solving. And so ultimately, that's really what we're doing, is helping organizations and individuals build their problem solving muscles. So let's talk about our agenda. Our agenda today is really about PDCA. And what I love about doing this webinar is we do webinars every month, and most of the time it's pretty much stuff we've been doing all along. But for this particular webinar, I actually did a lot of research and guess what? I learned some stuff too. And that's what I love about doing this is we're always learning. We're on the learning path. And I'm excited to share some of the things that I've learned too. So ultimately, today's agenda is about what is PDCA, the evolution of PDCA, because I actually think that there's a lot of strong opinions out there. And I was going after fact because we need more facts in this world. And then we're going to talk about the 4 steps of PDCA, PDCA and the A3, and PDCA and DMAIC and how they might fit together. So let's talk about what is PDCA. So first of all, if you haven't figured it out yet, it's an acronym. It stands for Plan, Do, Check, Act, and that's the original acronym. And so what is it though? It's an iterative 4-step method for solving problems related to processes, improving products and services. So for some people that may resist change, they might think that they might want PDCA to stand for please don't change anything. But in the world of process improvement, we wouldn't have an acronym that really stands for that, because we really are about trying to make things better, and that does involve change. So let's talk a little bit more about Plan, Do, Check, Act. So it is a cyclical process, and at a high level, really what you're doing in the plan phase is these are some of the steps you're doing: identifying the issue and the root cause, and you're designing experiments to address the root cause. But there's a couple of other things you're doing in plan that we're going to talk about later: identifying a problem and goal, formulating a theory, and then trying to figure out what the root cause is. So we're going to discuss that in a little bit. So these activities are followed by the do step. And in do, ultimately what you're doing is you're implementing, or you're running experiments or applying countermeasures to fix the root cause. And a lot of times you're saying, well, I think this might work, this countermeasure, and let's try it. Let's run an experiment and see if it works. Now, some people go, what's a countermeasure? Sometimes the word solution indicates a permanent fix, where countermeasures is really more speaking to a temporary solution, if you will, to address the root cause at hand. And so the idea is that it is cyclical. You don't, if you put a solution in, the thought is you don't ever have to look at it again. But really with countermeasures, you're really addressing what you see at hand now. And it doesn't mean you won't revisit it later or try to make another improvement later in another cycle. So that's ultimately why we use countermeasures versus solutions in this method. Then we have the check step. And ultimately, what you're doing here is you're checking to see if it worked. You're actually looking at the experiment, and you're really looking to see if it worked. And if it didn't, what could be done differently? What could we change? You compare results to the goal. And then you're doing a sort of an assessment, if you will, of your experiment. And then finally, the last step is that you're going to be acting. And a lot of people use adjust now, because sometimes people say, well, what's the difference between do and act? Well, ultimately, act is really saying you're going to fine tune it, you're going to make some adjustments to it, and then continue the cycle of planning. So ultimately, that is the 4 steps. It's a never ending cycle of continuous improvement. The idea is you're always in this cycle. And the idea is it's really how you think. So I think that's the cycle piece that we really want to speak to. It's not a one and done. So a lot of times when we think about projects, a lot of organizations think, okay, the project is complete. What's the next thing? But with PDCA, it's not just a cycle. It's the way to think about something, and it's that continual process of thinking through experiments to make things better. So it becomes more culturally what's happening. So I have a poll for you already, and this is really more designed to see what you know so far about PDCA. And again, this is introductory, so if you don't know the answer, that is okay. We have a poll for you, and we're going to launch the poll, and I'm going to have you actually tell us your thoughts here. This is basically, what else is PDCA known as? And you've got a couple of examples. You've got Plan, Do, Check, Adjust, Plan, Do, Study, Act, the Deming cycle, the Schuhart cycle, all of the above. So what do you guys think? Go ahead and enter in your thoughts. What do you think, Elizabeth? Do you think that this is a trick question?
I think it's easier to hear me if I'm not on mute. I think it could be a trick question, Tracy. I think it could be a trick question.
It could
I,
be.
these guys are all familiar. I mean, familiar to us, of course. Dr. Deming and Schuhart. They both came out of Bell Labs. There was the Hawthorne works. There's a lot of big quality people that came out of that back before they broke Bell Labs up into what we now know as the million different phone companies we've got. But anyway, they had lots of good quality folks there.
Good. And if you have any more insight to some of that, when I talk about the evolution of PDCA, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear some of your thoughts on that too.
Cool. Happy.
All right, let me close the poll and see what we got.
So what you got was almost half the folks thinking it's all of the above. And then the next group of 31% thought it was plan, do, check, adjust. And then they thought it was the Deming cycle, and that's 13%. And then 9% thought it was plan, do, study, act, and 2% thought it was the Schuhart cycle. So half
So
the
the
group is
correct
on to it.
answer. The correct answer is E, all of the above. So it's true. PDCA has been known for all of these things. So obviously, the acronym standing for PDCA is obviously plan, do, check, adjust. But in terms of the methods, they have been called all of these other things by various people throughout the years. And so I think that's what was interesting to me is when I started doing more historical research on PDCA, it was, you know, a lot of people believe that PDCA came from Deming, and it didn't. It actually came from his mentor, Walter Schuhart. And a lot of people called it the Schuhart cycle. The Deming cycle is also there, and also sometimes people called it the Deming wheel. So we're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of PDCA. And I think it's very interesting. So, you know, a lot of people, again, think, well, Deming started it. And then some people say, well, no, Walter Schuhart started it. And it's true. He did coin the term, but really PDCA started way before Walter Schuhart. And that was with the scientific method. And that was in the 16th century. And if you look at the definition of scientific method, which is basically saying it consists of systematic observation, measurement, experiment, formulation, testing, and modification of a hypothesis. These are all elements of what we know of PDCA and even some of the more modern philosophies that are existing as well. And so this was really interesting to me. And they've even, there's some recordings of Galileo Galilei's work consisting of some of these steps, which I thought was really interesting. And if you have more of an interest in learning about the historical elements of PDCA more and beyond this webinar, I would suggest an excellent white paper I came across in some of my research. It's available with the Deming Institute, and it's on the Deming.org website. It's called Foundation and History of the PDSA Cycle by Ronald Moen and Cliff Norman. And basically, this article provides a history of Edward Deming's PDSA cycle, but it also shows some of the work by Galileo in the 1600s, moves through Deming's last version of PDSA cycle of 1993, but it talks about Schuhart cycle in 1939, the Deming wheel in 1950, and the use from the Japanese between 1951 and 1985. So I think it was very interesting, and we're going to speak a little bit to it here. But if you really want to do some more reading, I thought it was great, and I'm passing it along, and we'll post that on our website as well. So ultimately, Walter Schuhart did coin the term PDCA, and he has been known as the father of modern quality back then. And Edward Deming was his student and his spiritual son. So Schuhart really introduced this concept. What he's really known for is SPC, which is statistical process control. But ultimately, his really big contribution as well is PDCA. So he worked in, as you had said, Elizabeth, at Bell Labs, and he also worked with the Western Electric Company, and he was the mentor for Deming and also worked alongside Joseph Juran and had some influence with some of those other statisticians. So he later worked at Hawthorne until 1925, and then again he worked at the Bell Telephone Research Labs. And so there's a lot of history here, and it's really interesting to see and hear and read about the relationships that some of these statisticians that are known as our granddaddies of quality, and how they've had interaction and have been working side by side. Any interesting pieces of information you want to share about some of this history, Elizabeth, since you had brought
Um,
it up?
I think also that Walter Schuhart was famous for creating the control chart. As you say, that comes under statistical process control, but it's a tool that we use widely to understand whether processes are performing normally or if there's something new and different happening in the process. That he developed a way of sussing that out, if there's common cause variation or whether there's special cause variation. So that's another thing about Walter Schuhart that we appreciate.
Yes, we do. And we talk about that every time we're in Greenbelt training. Thanks, Elizabeth. So let's talk a little bit about Deming. So again, the evolution of PDCA came from his mentor, Walter Schuhart. And like any good student, Mr. Deming really started working with and practicing the PDCA elements. And he's probably most well known for his work in Japan. He helped the Japanese after World War II sort of rise from the ashes and help them develop, very good products, excellent processes, for quality products. And I remember in the 80s how Japanese products were absolutely the premium product. I'll give you a little insight to say that I actually worked okay, I'm going to date myself here. I used to work at Circuit City in college, and I worked in the audio department. And what I thought was really interesting is we'd have people come in all the time, and they would want me to pull these receivers off the wall so they could see if it was made in Japan, and they wouldn't buy it if it wasn't made in Japan. And so that's a testament to the quality of that Japanese products were associated with back then. And so Deming really helped bring that along for them. And in relation to PDCA, he started to look at the cycle, and he really made some changes to it. So he really felt strongly about changing PDCA to PDSA, and the S stood for study, not check. And ultimately, it's because he really wanted to focus on, he thought that check was more about implementation of a change with success or failure. And he really wanted to focus on studying the actual results and comparing them to possibly revising the theory and then trying the cycle again. So, and he actually did some work and collaborated with Dr. Kaoru Ishikawa, most known for his fishbone diagram, in involving some of these PDSA steps. So that was also an interesting historical finding that I was like, oh, I didn't know that. He wrote some books. Deming had the 14 key principles for managers to transform business. And he first presented those in his book, Out of the Crisis. If anyone's an avid reader, you could take a look at that book and see really how much of what is said in that book is prevalent today in some of our process improvement methods. So, and then I think also there's an entire institute, as I had mentioned earlier, on Edward Deming in Washington, D.C. There's a collection at the Library of Congress, includes extensive audio tapes and videotapes if you have an interest in doing some more historical research, which I think can be a lot of fun. So let's talk now a little bit about some of the detailed steps within PDCA. Because when you actually apply it, it's a little, you need a little bit more guidance than just 4 steps. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what those detailed steps are so that you can, for someone who might want to follow this practice and method. And so I will also say that it was interesting that there's different schools of thought out there about what these more detailed steps would be. So I have my own that I've been following. And when I did some more research just to look at what other people are doing, I found 8 steps, I found 10 steps, I found 12 steps. So I think the point of it is everybody's trying to help people implement this. And sometimes people have their own way of explaining what these specific steps are, but I have seen some variation. I'm not going to say that's bad. I think, if it's effective and it works for that audience, then that's great. So here's some of the general steps for practical problem solving. I will say, though, that I think one of the most popular and prevalent steps is the Toyota's business practice, within the PDCA. The steps for practical problem solving is what they call it. And as you can see, there are 5 steps in the plan phase. And so you can imagine that the most of the work is front loaded for PDCA. So you're doing a lot of things like clarifying the problem and breaking down the problem, setting a target, analyzing root cause, developing countermeasures. So you're doing all of that before you actually do anything. And I think what most people are familiar with is we have a problem, we jump to solution. And so we kind of skip all these steps. You know, most people in corporate America, I'll say, I can't speak to all of you in other countries, but in corporate America, we love jumping to solutions, and we're actually rewarded to jump to solutions. I think even there's a some sort of management sign you can buy that says, "Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions." Right? So we have constantly been rewarded to jump to solution. And ultimately, what PDCA and many other forms of process improvement are saying is, hey, slow down a little bit. Don't just jump to solution. Stick with the problem a little bit. Understand the problem, understand the process, find root cause first, right? So ultimately, that's what we're doing in plan. There's a lot of work that's happening in there. But I think the natural intuitive thing for many people to do is just put in a solution. So plan has 5 steps. Do has 1. You're basically implementing the solution to address the root causes, or I will say countermeasures here. You're implementing those countermeasures and running an experiment to see if it's actually working, if it's going to actually resolve the root cause. And that's an important step too, because I think sometimes people want to implement the solution and then just walk away. And I have actually seen that happen in real life where people implemented a solution and there were still kinks that needed to be worked out, but they basically said, well, we don't have time to actually adjust it. And that's unfortunate because now the employees are in pain and they're told they can't make an improvement to or tweak to make the process better, which is sort of flies in the face of this methodology, unfortunately. And then we have check, which is what I just said. Did it actually work? Did the improvement, did the countermeasure actually work? How is it going? Are you going to change your hypotheses? And do you have a new hypothesis potentially that you're going to test? And again, adjust it or act. Learn from those failures. If the improvement worked, are you going to standardize some of that? Are you going to set another target? Those are some of the things that are happening in ACT. So we're going to talk briefly about some of these, and I'm just going to kind of take them one by one. And you're probably going to notice as I walk through some of this that if you've done any process improvement before, like Lean or Six Sigma or Lean Six Sigma or Total Quality Management, you're going to probably see some familiarity with this because guess what? They all came from the same broth, basically. We just got different vegetables here. So ultimately, the first thing you're doing is clarifying the problem. And I work with a lot of people on this step. And I think what's interesting is how often people don't get it right, unfortunately, especially new people. And of course, that's why we're there. We're there to help people understand this step. So ultimately, you start with a problem. You're starting with a gap of some kind or a problem, and it's usually something with a process. It's not something people related or some sort of solution you want to implement. And so I think that's really important. Is I always try to get people to write out what is the problem. And even though I tell people don't blame anybody, you can't say the problem is the accounting department because they suck. That's not appropriate. And you don't want to have a root cause in here because, again, the whole point of this methodology is to really look and identify what the root cause is. You might have a theory of what the root cause is, and we'll show you where to put that, but it doesn't belong in the problem statement. And finally, problem statement should not have a solution in it. And I think people confuse the 3 of them a lot: problems, root causes, and solutions. I think if people just generally knew what the definitions of those were and could speak appropriately to those, there would be a lot less confusion in this world. I'll give you an example. This is an example from the Bahama Bistro. The problem is we need to hire more people. I mean, how often do you hear people say that? That's not a problem. That's a solution. What are you trying to resolve as a result of hiring people? And so we really have to sometimes back into what it is. What is the problem we're trying to solve? Let's not jump to solution. Let's get agreement on the problem. And so that's really what your problem statement is going to answer for you is what is the problem or the issue? What is the measurable thing you're trying to impact? So usually a problem statement is going to have a measure in there somewhere as well. So the next step would be to break down the problem. And that's really about assessing and getting a grasp of the current condition. And so again, this is something often without process analysis and process improvement, people skip. How often have you seen people just slap on random solutions without really knowing what's going on in the process today, right? Or let's say you have a new person and they just want to bring in their solutions and slap it on. And that's so frustrating for people that have been working in that process for a while, because you don't even know what our process is and you're already slapping solutions on. So the idea around this is, let's break down the problem. Let's grasp the current condition of the situation. So let's talk a little bit about that. So there's a number of things you could do in this step in itself. One is, again, getting clarity on the measure and really saying, okay, here's where we are today. But ultimately, walking the process could help a lot with grasping the current condition. And so a process walk, we have lots of resources on our website on how to do a process walk. I think we have 2 webinars on process walks for participants, and we've got interview sheets. This is a great way to grasp the current situation. And then ultimately getting a sense of what's happening in the process. So don't focus on the people, focus on the process. And what can we do? I always say people that are in a bad process, they're victims. They're the biggest victims of being in that process. And the sad part is, most of the time they're getting blamed for it. And so that's unfortunate. And if we're blaming them, why do they want us? Would they want to help anybody learn about what their process is? Because they're always on the defense. So get an idea of what the current situation is and do the process walk. And then the other thing is, sometimes you have to break down the bigger problem. Sometimes you have to really isolate a step in the process or reduce the scope so that it feels manageable. Because often what I also find is people are picking boil the ocean projects, or solving world hunger. And it's so monumental, they don't even know where to get started. They're paralyzed. And so making it something achievable, manageable, and meaningful is really important in this part of the process, because we want it to be something that moves people forward, but doesn't feel like it's solving world hunger that you're not going to be able to get any traction for 5 years. So ultimately, there's a lot of things you could be doing here in breaking down the problem. And again, building profound knowledge of the current state is one way to get an understanding of what's happening and then figuring out what is within your scope. So it could be walking the process, like we've said, mapping it, collecting data, interviewing people. All of these things are part of breaking down the problem. So then you were able to set a target to achieve. So this is again agreeing on a goal, and an expected outcome. And so again, this is, I'm explaining this linearly, but sometimes people set this earlier, sometimes they set it a little later, but the point is you've got it somewhere in plan. I find that you have to set a target. You can set a target once you understand the problem, but when you get a better grasp of what's happening, you might change the goal. And then when you discover root cause, you might change the goal again. So again, this is very exploratory, and that's going to be the nature of the progress with when you do something like plan, do, check, adjust. It's very different than project management, where project management might have a charter and you're tasked with implementing something and you don't want to move the milestones. And if they change, it's bad potentially. Well, in this case, no, these things are going to be changing in the plan phase, in the plan step. It's the nature of the beast. You don't know what the problem is. You don't know what the root causes are. And when you discover them, you're going to have to look at what the target is, and you might have to make a change. Ultimately, the goal statement or the goal does have some measurable target to make it concrete. I think that is something that I see process improvement teams struggle with a lot, is they don't really know what they're trying to achieve in a measurable form. And when you get clarity, ultimate clarity on what you're trying to improve, you're going to see really creative ideas and innovative ideas on how to go about doing that. So this is just an example of some data on a histogram, and it basically is saying, for orders at the Bahama Bistro, it's lunch orders. The average lead time is beyond 20 minutes. So you could see here, this pink line, this is the target in this case. Sometimes that line is an average, but in this case, I really like it when they use it as the expected. This is what we want it to be. And here's what's actually happening. So this histogram in green is saying, here's how the data is really performing right now. We've got an average of 28 minutes from 100 lunch orders that we've looked at, and we really want it to be under 20. So we have to move this entire histogram to the left of 20 minutes. And so that is great because it gives people a visual in one graph of what is expected and what is actually happening. And so it's a really nice visual. And then getting clarity around that can really help teams be very focused on what needs to happen and be very creative about how we can achieve that. So that's a part of plan. And one of the last steps in plan, analyze root cause. So again, this is when you're really trying to figure out, why is it taking so long? Why is it beyond this 20 minutes? What is causing the lunch orders to take 28 minutes on average? So this is really when, again, we don't want to blame people. We say the chef, he doesn't know what he's doing. We don't want to blame people. We really want to analyze the process and collect some data. We actually want to incorporate the chef's ideas and involve him on trying to help us solve this problem. And he needs to feel safe about being able to participate in a way that he's not going to get blamed. Because remember, a lot of people feel like they're going to get blamed. They're not going to help you. So again, recruit, involve people really all along this process, and go ahead and participate in conducting some of this root cause analysis and this data analysis. And you might look at a lot of things. You might actually produce some graphs. You might look at a swim lane. You might do some Pareto charts in terms of where the biggest defects are occurring. Or you might say, here's the things that are taking the longest to cook or to prep. And again, it's related to the product, the food. It's not, I'm going to time the chef and find out what's wrong with him, right? So again, we need these people. We need people in the front line to help us come up with hypotheses and to find out if they're true or not. Don't make them your enemy. And so ultimately, that's what you're doing in the analyze root cause phase. And hopefully you will find one. As a matter of fact, you can't really leave this step until you find root cause, because the next step is develop countermeasures. So countermeasures, again, as I had said before, these are potential temporary solutions that we think might address the root cause. Well, you can't come up with those if you don't know the root cause. So you really can't move forward on number 5 until you actually have root causes identified from step 4. So we really want to make sure that we brainstorm ideas for countermeasures and select the things that we want to implement as part of the do phase. So ultimately, that's what you're doing. And these might be some of the things you end up planning to do. So workload balancing, you might decide, or standard work, you're going to create standard work, or let's do some 5S, or, I notice there's a lot of movement by the chef or the prepper when they're building salads. Maybe we need to reorganize that space so that it works, it flows better. And, I also noticed that the chef was running back to get some more stock items, during our prime time season, time of the day. Maybe we need to make sure that he doesn't have to do that. Maybe we need bigger bins so that there's less running around and moving around. So these are all things potentially that you might be deciding that you're going to do. And again, you do this in plan, but you actually implement them in the do phase, which is what it says here. So you implement those countermeasures, you coordinate and launch a pilot test or an experiment, and then document those things so that people know what they're supposed to be doing. And also you can observe and see if it's working too. So again, in do, now we're moving out of plan and into do, you're actually doing the ideas that you have, the countermeasures for the root causes that you found. So again, there's a lot of excitement in this step. We see that people love this step because, they've been spending a lot more time early, before this step, getting ready for exploration. What are the root causes? And, unfortunately, I have to say, for people who are so used to being in solution mode, plan is hard for them. They feel like it's unclear, it's confusing. I feel a sense of urgency because I don't know if we're doing anything. I've heard all of these things for people that are typically jumping to solution. They're very uncomfortable in plan. They want to get out of there as soon as possible. so, so we really have to sort of, I don't know, give them therapy or something. Talk to them, talk through it. It's going to be fine. This is normal. This is normal. How you're supposed to feel is it's exploratory. We don't know what we're implementing yet. So I've had to have these conversations many times with people that are new to process improvement and root cause analysis. So once you get to do, hopefully what ends up happening is now you can reflect on those results. You evaluate the process, you evaluate the results. And again, this is the part where Deming was really saying, let's study this. Do we have a new hypothesis? What worked and what didn't? What did the participants think of the pilot? What do they think needs to be changed? What did they really think worked? And document those learnings. So this is really a checking up against, did we actually get the results we wanted based on the countermeasures that were implemented? And sometimes the answer is no. And so sometimes we create a new theory and we start the PDCA cycle over because we're not going to adjust it. We're going to keep moving forward. And sometimes it's because, yes, it did work. We're going to make a couple of tweaks here, and ultimately see how that works. We might actually implement it to a broader group or something like that. So it really depends. Act and adjust is really around, what did you discover? I mean, did it actually work? And, there's a set of steps that are going to happen if you actually decide you're going to formalize it, you're going to implement it to a broader group. And so those steps are really around sustainability or expansion of what was learned and the solution. Or you might decide you're going to make some adjustments. You're going to do another cycle of PDCA before you make it broader to a broader group. So, or you might just say, what, that didn't work at all. I think we had the wrong solution or wrong countermeasure for the root causes. And maybe we even have the wrong root cause. And hopefully that's not the case. As a matter of fact, often I find that when we don't get the results that we want, it's often because the countermeasure wasn't implemented as well as we thought, or that we thought it was being implemented, but only a small set of people implemented it. So often when we have to back up because it wasn't the results we wanted, it's because we found out something didn't go perfectly or during the implementation of the countermeasure. And so that's typically what I've seen. And if you spend more time up front in plan, it's gonna make all the other steps much more effective. But I find people sometimes want to just check the box and get out of plan so they can get to do. And guess what? You're gonna end up right back in there very soon, probably sooner than you expected because some of that work wasn't done. So it's really important to really do a good job in plan and just pause with what you're doing. Don't just check the box. Really try to build that knowledge. Try to really be motivated in understanding the current process and what the root causes are. So again, if you did have some success with the study, you're probably going to set up some sort of monitoring plan to make sure that things are actually being implemented. The natural tendency for humans is, even if there's a change, the natural tendency is to revert back to the old way because that is what people know. That is what they're comfortable with. Sometimes people have been doing those steps for 20 years and now they got to do it different. They can do it in autopilot, but now they actually have to think. And so guess what? Sometimes people revert back to the old way, even if the new way is more effective and more efficient and better for the customer. So that's why we got to have monitoring. You just have to make sure that the new process is being followed. And that's an important piece of that. I always hear about people that say, oh yeah, we did actually make an improvement, but then, it didn't sustain because people stopped doing it. And so that's a concern. And so the monitoring plan and monitoring how the process is working, the new process, and if people are following it is great. So this is where I think process adherence comes into play and can be really important. So again, I think the other idea around PDCA is it is cyclical. It's a wheel on purpose because it's sort of never ending, and it's sort of speaking to this idea that what, it's okay, experimenting is okay, failure is okay. It has to be okay for the organization to share and learn their lessons in order to grow. And I think this is sometimes very it's absent often in organizations. People don't want to screw up, they don't want to get in trouble, and experimentation is not okay in some places. And I get that. Like, for example, I work a lot with government, and they are very risk averse as a whole. I'm not going to. That's a generic statement. I'm not saying everybody's risk averse, and every organization in government is risk averse. But they don't want to end up in the papers. They don't want that kind of attention, and so they have to be careful. And it's very hard sometimes to be innovative and experiment and be willing to take risks when you've got that looming over your head. And so the idea behind these cycles is that you are going through experimentation and it's okay to fail. And I think, what can you do about that? So I was working with an organization, and they really were, we sort of were observing people in the organization, and made the discovery that it really wasn't okay to fail in this organization. And the leaders really were trying to figure out what they could be doing differently to help people feel that they could experiment, and it's okay that we're not perfect. And so one of the things that they were doing in terms of strategy was they started admitting their failures as leaders. They started telling their organization where they were trying to learn and get better. And when people were, putting up on their boards red dots, they were actually thanking people for admitting that there were problems to be worked on. They were promoting the fact that, hey, yellow and red on visual boards are okay. That means that you've identified a problem and that you're working on it, as opposed to having a visual board that has, indicators, green, yellow, red, and they're all green, which there are many organizations that have boards and they've got indicators and everything on there is green. So that tells me that you are perfect. You don't have to do anything to improve because everything is perfect. And so we sort of have to get away from that. Is very telling to me when I see that in an organization. That means that it's not okay to fail. It's not okay to have yellows or reds on your boards. And, I start to question some of the leaders about what are they doing when they see a red or a yellow dot on those things. So here's a quote from Thomas Edison, and it's I've not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that it won't work. Well, hopefully you don't have 10,000 ways that it won't work. Hopefully you have 4 or 5, 4 or 5 ways that it didn't work. And so just get out there, experiment. If you're a leader, make it okay for your people to experiment. It's really important. And if they're not doing these PDCA cycles, sometimes it's there's a cultural element that we need to address as well. And that is an entirely new and different webinar. So some of you have maybe heard about A3s. And A3s, if you don't know what they are, it's actually the name of international paper size, actually. And it's a summary of someone's thinking through a problem. So it's a way to help people go through this thinking process, this root cause analysis, this PDCA thinking. And it's not about the paper, it's about the thinking. But I wanted to just point out that if you look at what a lot of A3s have on them, they're following plan, do, check, act, or plan, do, check, adjust. And so A3s, I think there's a lot of mistaken understanding of the A3. People start to, they do the problem solving and then they feel like they got to fill this paper out and turn it in. And it feels very kind of Big Brother-ish. And really, that's not the point of A3. You should be using it while you're problem solving, while you're thinking through a problem. It's supposed to help you document your thinking and some of these steps. It's not a check the box activity. And so as a leader, we have an entire series on how leaders can use A3s to help coach people through this thinking. And so I just wanted to point that out. If you really want to understand and apply PDCA, Using A3s is a great way to do that. Using A3s through the whole process, not just filling it out and turning it in later. So here's just an example of an A3. And again, we're not going to spend time explaining an A3 on this webinar. We actually have a webinar for A3 as leaders, and I think we'll be having an A3, how to use an A3 webinar coming out very soon as well. But ultimately, you could see that it is following some of the steps of PDCA. All right, I got another poll for you. So true or false? DMAIC and PDCA are both forms of the scientific method. True or false? I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. So go ahead and fill in the poll for us. And there's lots of other process improvement things out there too, not just DMAIC, not just PDCA. But go ahead and vote, and let's see what you guys think. Elizabeth, what do you think?
I think you know what I think. It's interesting that we've kind of come down to these being the most prevalent improvement models, a 5-step and a 4-step. There are, I remember one that was based on the word process. So that was 7-step. I've seen 8-step. I think the fewer steps, I think 4 or 5, it's kind of like our theories on a team. You don't want to get too far beyond 4 or 5-step. So even though when you break it down, there's more going on in each of these steps, these are good high-level numbers of steps.
Yep,
And
I agree.
I'm interested to see what folks think.
All right, let's close the poll and see.
Yeah. So most people, that's 88%, believe that these are both forms of the scientific method, Tracy.
Yep. Yep. And to this point, I think what's interesting in some of this research that I've been doing lately on these particular subjects is there's a lot of strong opinions out there about what's better and who's wrong. And to me it's an evolving thing, right? So look at PDCA. It's been around since Walter Schuhart, and even his mentor Deming changed it. Said, no, this is what I like better. And so I think sometimes you'll hear, for those of you that are attending this webinar, you're going to hear process wars. That's what we call it, is, people fighting over which methodology is better. And, GoLean6Sigma.com has always said, hey, I don't really care where it came from. If it solves the problem, that's what's important. If you're actually applying a methodology that's root cause analysis and you're finding the root cause, and then you're actually solving for root cause, you're doing the right thing. Right? But when you're learning it, I think it's people want things a little bit more prescriptive. They want to be said, well, how exactly do I learn this stuff and apply it? And I think DMAIC does a good job of that. PDCA does a good job of that. There's a lot of people out there. And so, they all come from this idea of the scientific method of understanding your problem, coming up with a hypothesis of what you think the root causes are, confirming that it is truly the root cause, and then coming up with these potential solutions. So I just put PDCA and DMAIC side by side, and you can see that plan is also part of define, measure, analyze. And I guess developing an improvement solution is maybe where they differ a little bit, because developing that countermeasure is in plan, where in DMAIC it's under the improve phase. So, but very similar, and ultimately it's still following the scientific method. So I don't, if it's easier for you guys to learn PDCA and then DMAIC differently by itself, that's up to you. But ultimately, I feel like my learning and my experience has been enhanced by knowing both. And hopefully you see the same thing. Hopefully you see that any of these learnings aren't wrong. They're different methods and approaches, and all of them work. And so how do you get really good at really the purpose of these, which is root cause analysis and solving for root cause? Okay, just a couple of quotes to keep you motivated, if you will. One of them is from Edward Deming. This is one of my favorite quotes. And I think a natural thing is we do focus on people a lot. We blame people a lot. And the truth is, if you put a good person in a bad system, the system will win every time. And I don't think we do that enough. I think we tend to beat people up in processes. So just keep that in mind as you go through root cause analysis. And it's, there are the biggest victims of the process. And why does this happen so much? Well, in transactional environments, processes are invisible. You can't see the process. And so we blame what we see, the people. Processes are invisible. So make sure that you elevate the process, make it visible, and focus on the process when you do process improvement. Don't beat up the people. You need them. You need the people to help you solve the process. And it's funny because even if I say that, people send me a note and they go, but what if it is the person? All right, focus on the process first. That's what these tools are for. Use the tools. And you know what? If it is a person, that is not process improvement. That's HR. And then finally, there's a way to do it. There's a way to do it better. Find it. That's by Thomas Edison. And you know what? He did it 10,000 times. He tried to find it. So we could try it 4 or 5 times and hopefully find a solution. All right, so guess what? That brings us to the end of the webinar. What we covered today is what is PDCA, the evolution of it, the 4 steps of it. We talked a little bit about A3s and how that incorporates PDCA, and we did a little bit of comparison of PDCA and DMAIC briefly. So the next step is questions. If you have questions for me or Elizabeth, please type them in the chat window and we will get those answered for you. We've got about 6 minutes to answer any questions that you may have. And while we're waiting for you guys to put in your questions, I'll just cover a few more slides based on some of the things that that are other opportunities for you. So look, if you haven't had any training yet, we've got lots of training online. Our white belt's free, and we have yellow belt, green belt, black belt, and lean. And you also can get a 20% discount on all courses because you've attended this webinar and you've got the coupon code. So go ahead and use that where appropriate. We also have another webinar coming up, May 24th at 11 a.m. And Elizabeth will be facilitating that. It's called How to Make the Swim Lane Map Work for You. So Elizabeth, you want to give them any insight to that?
Sure. The swim lane map is also called a deployment map or a cross-functional map. We call it swim lane because that's the structure. It comes in lanes, and each lane represents a department or a group. So they're really popular, these maps. We're going to talk about how to build it, how to analyze it, how to augment that analysis. And this is an intermediate webinar. Sign up. We'd love to have you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And we also have our latest podcast out. Elizabeth got to interview Chip Schaefer from the Chicago Bulls about boxing out injuries. Tell us a little bit about that interview.
So this is a great one. We noticed that Chip had been downloading single modules on root cause analysis, the fishbone, the 5 whys, and also FMEA, which is risk assessment and mitigation. And we wanted to know, what's he doing with it? He works for the NBA. He's director of sports performance. And on this interview, he tells us what he did with it, which is looked at why athletes got injured and how to resolve that and reduce injuries and keep athletes on the court. He's a great guy. It was a really fun interview. I highly recommend tuning into that one.
Very nice. We also have a success story out this month from Kristen Kielick, and she is from UC San Diego, and she talks about how she actually her team saved 2,000 hours a year in the employee onboarding process. And what organization does not have that process? We all need new employees. And if you want to do it in a better, faster way, you should really tune into Kristen's success story webinar. All right, let's talk about questions.
So here's a question for you, Tracy. And this one comes from Jenny. And she wants to know, if a countermeasure is a temporary solution, what's considered a permanent solution? At what point does a countermeasure turn into a permanent solution? Is it a temporary solution because it's awaiting the evaluation and results?
Well, that's a great question. And I really believe that the countermeasure is the reason why they call it a countermeasure is because they want people to really be cognizant of the fact that installing permanent solutions may not always be what you're trying to do at this step. And so, yeah, I feel like once you've confirmed that something is working and that you're going to sort of create more of a broad implementation, it could be a solution that is going to be permanent for a while. But again, I think in general, the use of solution, the word solution, sometimes feels like people never need to revisit it again. And countermeasures just reminds people that, you know what, it's okay. It's okay if you make it better at some point. Processes should be looked at all the time, not every second of the day, but they should be looked at every year. And what worked 2 years ago may not be the best solution today. And so it's the idea of knowing that countermeasures are going to be cyclical as opposed to solutions being permanent. And I think it's just their way of saying, hey, just know that solutions aren't always permanent, especially in today's world. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was great. I
Do you
think
have any
that's
thoughts around that, Elizabeth? Or you want
no,
to
I
just get
think
to
you
the next
nailed it. That's the reality is it's just your attitude toward the changes you're making, that there's always a better way. You should always be looking for the better way. Okay, one more question, and I think that'll take us to the hour. You've got from Stephen, how do you explain why workers will revert back to the old way, even when the new process is more efficient for them and better for the customer?
So I did mention that a little bit in the webinar, and I just think it's habit. Habits are hard to break. As a matter of fact, I'm reading a great book on habits, The Power of Building Habits. I can't remember the author's name right now, but I am so entrenched in it right now because it is really talking about this that habits sometimes supersede everything else. And that so that's really what you need to do is recognize that it could be a habit. And if someone has been doing this process for 5 years and now they've got to do it a different way, sometimes they'll just come in and they'll be on autopilot and they just start doing it the old way.
Yeah.
And it really is, habits are sometimes stronger than new, better processes. I hope that helps.
It's so true. And I just want to remark the book here that Tracy's talking about is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. I think it's Duhigg. It's an odd spelling last name. And yes, I
Yes.
totally agree with you, Tracy, that change is just uncomfortable, especially if you've got an ingrained habit. And one more
And
thing for you, Tracy, and then we're going to sign off.
yes.
Christopher
Okay.
says, awesome. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining this webinar. I really hope that you found some value in it. If you have any more questions, please come to our website or send us a note at contact@golean6sigma.com. As a reminder, yes, the slides will be available and the recording will be available on our website as well. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye, all.